This is Istanbul Airport, one of the largest airports on Earth, built from nothing in just 4 years. This is Beijing Daxing, a 7-runway megahub designed, built, and opened in under 5 years. Now, take a look at Berlin Brandenburg, an airport that was supposed to be Germany's next crown jewel, a modern global hub meant to handle millions of passengers. But here's where things change. While the rest of the world throws up mega airports in half a decade, Germany, the country whose entire reputation is built on precision, took almost 22 years just to reach its first opening date. And that's not even the embarrassing part. When safety inspectors finally walked through its gleaming new terminal in 2012, weeks before the grand opening, they found a massive 120,000 defects. Everything from cooling pipes with no insulation to a broken fire safety system designed by a man who, it turned out, wasn't even an engineer. The situation was so bad that the opening ceremony had to be canceled. The chief engineer was fired, and the entire airport had to be redesigned. And Germany, the country that built its entire global reputation on precision and competence, became an international punchline. And even when the airport finally opened in October 2020, almost 8 years after the first opening date and more than 5 billion euros over budget, a new question began to echo. Was this airport really needed? Because Berlin already had 3 functioning airports at the time of its construction. So why did Berlin even build this airport? And how did things go so wrong? This is the story of how Germany built the most embarrassing airport in modern history, and why, even today, it's struggling to survive. It was November 9th, 1989. The Berlin Wall finally falls following the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And West Berlin reunifies with East. But Berlin and Germany as a whole had new problems to deal with. Berlin's population had effectively doubled overnight, and what had been 2 parallel societies now had to function as one. That meant merging 2 disparate economies, 2 vastly different infrastructure systems, 2 governments, and even 2 different cultures. While many in East Berlin had lost their jobs, people in the West came to view their new counterparts not as neighbors, but as an economic liability. So, as the leaders of the newly reunified Berlin searched for an opportunity that would truly unite both sides, they realized that its 3 airports, Tempelhof, Tegel, and Schönefeld, were not only outdated but incapable of handling the sheer volume of passengers the city now demanded. Worse still, airports like Tempelhof and Tegel were situated right in the middle of the city, with no realistic prospect of future expansion. So a consensus began to form that what Berlin truly needed was a brand new, modern airport, one comparable to those in Frankfurt and Munich, with the genuine capacity to handle whatever the future might bring. In 1991, a committee was formed and tasked with finding a suitable location for this new airport in the area around Berlin. And already, there were early signs that this project was not going to run smoothly. Because it took them 6 years just to decide on a site, and after that time, they ended up choosing here, right next to the existing Schönefeld Airport. At the time, Schönefeld already had 2 reasonably long runways and a terminal building. So the idea was that, or at least in theory, since there was enough space to expand the existing terminal, or even build a second one close by, all they had to do was expand and modernize to the newer standard. But there was a problem. Using the existing pair of runways was simply not possible, because those runways were situated too close to each other to allow simultaneous takeoffs and landings. Moreover, if Berlin wanted to become a true global hub, it needed a state-of-the-art airport capable of handling a large number of aircraft simultaneously. So the plan that emerged was to retain one of those runways, the more southerly of the two, and build a brand new runway even further to the south. That would not only free up the space between the two runways to build a modern terminal, but also provide ample room for parallel taxiways serving each runway, aircraft parking, and future expansion. But even after everyone had agreed on the general plan, more delays kept mounting, and it wasn't until 2006 that the plan was finally approved, just in time for the financial crisis of 2008.
Lehman Brothers is going bankrupt.
Major financial institutions have teetered on the edge of collapse.
Now it's official, we are in a recession.
The initial plan was to bring in private contractors to fund and build the airport. But the global economic downturn made it nearly impossible to find a private entity that was willing to take on that kind of financial risk. So the politicians there did what they do best: spend public money. Brandenburg Airport was now a fully public project, managed by a company jointly owned by the city of Berlin, the state of Brandenburg, and the German Federal Republic. And if you know anything about public projects, you know that they are often entangled in a bureaucratic mess and are often a source of incompetence and corruption. And that's exactly what happened here, but the scale at which it happened would shock the entire world. But here's the thing about a project like this. The damage doesn't happen all at once. It builds quietly in the background until someone finally checks and realizes how bad it's gotten. Which, weirdly, is exactly what's happening with our own personal data. Think about how much of your personal information you hand over just to travel. Flight bookings, hotel sites, loyalty programs, visa forms. Every one of those is a little deposit of you, and a lot of it ends up with data brokers, companies whose entire business is collecting your name, address, and phone number and selling it to the highest bidder, which could be a marketing agency, insurance company, or even criminals. That's why I use today's sponsor, Incogni. The moment you sign up, they start contacting all the data brokers holding your information and demand they take it down. No forms, no back and forth on your end, and because this stuff creeps back over time, Incogni keeps at it in the background, month after month. You can check the dashboard whenever you want and see how much of your data they've pulled off for you. The part I actually like, though, is custom removals. If you stumble onto your details on a specific site or some random directory, you just send Incogni the link and someone on their team handles it for you. Now, to get started, just scan this QR code or head over to incogni.com/BeyondSky. That gets you 60% off the annual plan. Just remember to use the code BeyondSky at checkout. And Incogni gives you a 30-day money-back guarantee so you can try it completely risk-free. Thanks Incogni for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the story. According to Martin Delius, a former Berlin city politician who later chaired an inquiry into the project, those in charge made an early decision that would prove catastrophic. Rather than awarding the construction to a single primary contractor who could be held accountable for the whole, they divided the work into a large number of smaller individual contracts, with separate companies responsible for each distinct section of the build. They did this in an attempt to drive down costs, but what they ended up creating was an enormously complicated system with too many decision makers, making it nearly impossible to oversee. If that wasn't bad enough, Meinhard von Gerken was brought on board as chief architect. Well, if you're not familiar with him, he was the man behind Berlin's landmarks like the Central Railway Station and Tegel Airport. And while he was undoubtedly a renowned architect, he was also an old-school architect who despised the way modern airports were built. You see, airports, whether publicly or privately owned, operate as commercial businesses, just like any other. And while the majority of their revenue comes from flight handling and cargo operations, retail plays a significant role in the profitability of any airport. That is exactly why every major terminal in the world is lined with duty-free shops, bars, and restaurants, and things are priced the way they are. But von Gurken hated shops. He hated how airports were becoming giant malls. In his own words, most passengers have no desire to buy anything. Why should I have to drag around 2 bottles of overpriced whiskey in a plastic bag like a beggar? So he designed his airport with as few retail outlets as possible. But when the airport company eventually reviewed his plans and realized what he had done, they were alarmed. After all, they expected to make up to 50% of their revenue from retail. So, just 9 months after construction had started, Berlin's then mayor Klaus Wowereit suddenly decided the new airport would be too small and ordered a redesign with a dedicated floor space for shopping, and also demanded new boarding gates capable of handling the A380, even though no airline had ever committed to bringing the aircraft to Berlin in the first place. All of these constant design changes meant the project was well behind schedule for the grand opening in October 2011. But as that date grew closer, airport authorities realized they weren't going to make it, so they quietly pushed the target back to June 2012, almost a full year behind schedule. Now, an opening date for something as significant as a major new airport will force all of the businesses affected to make their own plans around it. And I'm not just talking about ground handling companies or maintenance crews here. Businesses like coffee shops, duty-free retailers, and rental car companies all have to move their equipment, buy inventory, and hire staff, which in itself is an expensive process that has to be planned and managed many months, sometimes years in advance. So while all of this was happening, politicians were busy preparing for a grand opening ceremony to be attended by then-Chancellor Angela Merkel and other senior German officials. But when the safety inspectors arrived to carry out their pre-opening checks, what they found brought the entire proceedings to an abrupt halt. The opening ceremony was cancelled, and what followed was a revelation that stopped not just Germany, but the entire world in its tracks. The scale of the problems was almost incomprehensible. In total, inspectors cataloged more than 120,000 individual defects. And some of them were so fundamental that they raised serious questions about how the construction had been overseen in the first place. Take the main wall of the new terminal building, for instance, which faced west. But in this part of northeastern Germany, west is precisely where the wind and rain tend to come from. And whoever was responsible for that section had fitted air vents directly into that wall with no meaningful protection against the elements, meaning that rainwater was consistently finding its way into the building, damaging the interior. Then there were the cooling pipes, stretching a total of roughly 37 miles throughout the terminal, had been installed without any thermal insulation. By the time anyone noticed, those pipes were already buried behind completed walls, so fixing the problem meant tearing those walls open just to get to them. Compounding the matter further was the state of the fire suppression system. The entire setup, smoke extractors, sprinklers, emergency ventilation, had been designed to the specifications of von Gurken's original, much smaller airport, and when it was subjected to official safety testing, it failed. What made this particularly damaging was the fact that the person who had designed this system wasn't actually an engineer at all. Rather, he was an engineering draftsman who had been pretending to be an engineer this whole time. But when airport management realized that the airport had failed the crucial fire safety tests, they proposed a solution called a human-machine interface, where hundreds of workers would stand guard around the clock to watch for fires and operate emergency doors. Of course, anybody in their right mind would know that isn't a good idea, but apparently, airport management and the politicians at the time thought it was a realistic backup solution, and that's precisely why they had played down the prospect of more delays before the news broke. The fallout triggered a wave of resignations, and the chief architect of the project, von Gurken, was finally fired. In his place, the airport's owners brought in Hartmut Maydorn, a seasoned executive who had previously led both Deutsche Bahn and Air Berlin, and tasked him with finishing the project. But when Maydorn carried out his own investigation into the airport, what he found made the original figure of 120,000 defects look almost modest by comparison. his investigation uncovered a staggering 550,000 individual faults throughout the terminal. By the end of 2012, the project's budget had ballooned from its original estimate of 4.5 billion euros to well over 10 billion. And it was at this point that serious voices began calling for the entire thing to be abandoned and started again from scratch. But the project had already consumed far too much time, money, and political capital for that to be a realistic option. So they had no choice but to press on. Well, if you thought things at least got better from here, you're completely mistaken. Investigative reporting by DW, the German public broadcaster, found that in the years following the scandal, the same culture of dysfunction continued. The builders spent much of their time doing almost nothing at all, and the entire project had become a hotbed of criminality. Workers were stealing materials, such as copper and construction tools. In fact, many had turned it into a business, cutting cables and selling them for scrap. One insider, speaking anonymously, described the atmosphere plainly.
If you want to do nothing, it was relatively easy. If you want to do a lot, you could try. In the end, the plan changes again.
And when they finally opened Berlin Brandenburg Airport, they opened it in October 2020, a full 8 years after the first scheduled opening. And in the very year when the entire world had ground to a halt due to COVID, with virtually no passengers to speak of. Today, almost 6 years after that opening, Berlin Brandenburg continues to struggle. And according to some sources, the biggest problem with Berlin's new airport is that there might not have been a genuine need for it in the first place, or at least not in the way it was designed. You see, the original ambition was to build a major international hub, the kind where passengers fly in on short regional feeder flights and connect onward to long-haul destinations like Dubai, Singapore, or New York. To pull that off, Berlin needed to attract the big long-haul carriers, particularly those from outside Europe. That, after all, was the entire rationale behind the enormously expensive redesign, the one that added boarding gates specifically capable of handling the A380. But unlike Frankfurt or Munich, Berlin never became a hub for any major alliance airline. Not even Lufthansa, Germany's own flag carrier, chose to base its long-haul operations there. Without that anchor, the entire hub strategy collapsed before it ever really got started. Then, there were the design flaws that somehow survived more than a decade of construction. Because even though it was a brand new airport, one that cost over 10 billion euros, it somehow managed to get the basics spectacularly wrong. Take Terminal 2, for instance. There is no dedicated taxi or car drop-off point at the terminal at all, which means that every arriving passenger, regardless of how much luggage they are carrying, has to be dropped at Terminal 1 and then walk outdoors for several hundred meters across what looks, frankly, like an unfinished car park to reach Terminal 2. Inside the terminals, passengers have repeatedly complained about how cramped and confusing the layout is, with inadequate signage and a chronic shortage of seating that, during busy periods, leaves travelers sitting directly on the floor. But perhaps the most damaging problem of all is what's happening to Berlin itself. When global travel demand recovered following COVID-19, the pace of that recovery caught nearly everyone off guard. According to IATA, global passenger demand in 2024 didn't just return to pre-pandemic levels, it finished almost 4% above them. But Berlin tells a very different story. Tourist numbers visiting the city have fallen significantly since the pandemic, and that decline shows no sign of reversing. Tour operators report that visitors are increasingly put off by the levels of pollution and litter throughout the city, and the famous nightlife culture that once made Berlin one of the most exciting destinations in Europe is quietly disappearing. As a result, several European budget carriers, including Ryanair and EasyJet, have scaled back their operations to Brandenburg. That calculation is made considerably easier by the fact that Berlin already carries some of the highest aviation taxes and operating costs of any major German airport, making it an unattractive proposition for airlines operating on thin margins with no shortage of alternative bases to choose from. So, what do you think? Will the city eventually find a way to position this airport as the global hub it was always supposed to be? Or are we watching the early stages of a longer, quieter decline? Let us know in the comments.